Hello, everyone, and welcome here and online. My name is Frank Ruda. I am professor of modern and contemporary philosophy, as you might know. This is another installment of the Royal Institute of Philosophy, the university branch speaker series. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Miriam Leonard. She is professor of Greek literature and its reception at the University College in London. And after completing a PhD that was Cambridge 2002, she was at Bristol in the classics department for a while. And in 2007, joined the UCL. I'm just mentioning a number of important books. 2005, Athens and Paris, Ancient Greece and the Political and Post-War French Thought. How to Read Ancient Philosophy, that's 2008. A very wonderful collection, Derrida and Antiquity, that was in 2010. Socrates and the Jews, Hellenism and Hebraism, from Moses Mendelssohn to Sigmund Freud, that was 2012. And in 2015, Tragic Modernities. Miriam will speak today about the genres of revolution. I shut up. After the talk, we have the chance to discuss, and then afterwards we can all move to the DCA and continue the discussion. Thank you for being here, Miriam.
Thank you. Is it all right if I sit?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Frank. I've been an admirer of your work for a long time, so it's really wonderful to be here and lovely to come to Dundee. This, as Frank was mentioning, I'm a classicist, but I have an interest in the history of thought, in particular German and French thought. This paper is part of a very small book I'm writing on the kind of concept of revolution in relation to antiquity. Okay. I'll talk for about 45 minutes. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. Part one. The revolution will not be televised. So the French Revolution was a media event avant la lettre. Its aftermath produced such powerful narratives that they threatened to eclipse the original happening. This was nowhere more the case than in the German-speaking world. German writers at the end of the 18th century described the French Revolution as a drama for which their front row seats rendered them ideal spectators. In particular, the critic Rebecca Comey sees the French Revolution as the spectacle which enabled Immanuel Kant to transform the discourse of morality into an aesthetic register. Comey writes, in his third critique, Kant had already formalized the logic whereby terror experienced at slight distance yields the sublime satisfaction of moral self-enhancement. The imperative of disinterestedness that Kant assigned to the aesthetic sphere is transferred to the act of political spectatorship. Logic is ultimately Aristotelian, Comey writes, terror is purged through a vicarious catharsis secured by aesthetic distance. And yet in describing the reaction to the revolution in the conflict of the faculties, Kant recounts not so much a catharsis as its opposite. Quote, the revolution which we've seen taking place in our own times in a nation of gifted people may succeed or it may fail. It may be so filled with misery and atrocities that no right-thinking man would ever decide to make the same experiment again at such price, even if he could hope to carry it out successfully at the second attempt. But I maintain that this revolution has aroused in the hearts and desires of all spectators who are not themselves caught up in it a sympathy which borders almost on enthusiasm. The pity and fear evoked by the performance does not act apropaically on the audience, but rather enjoins the bystanders to join in. This is a spectacle which breaks down the fourth wall. But writing almost a century later in Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche makes clear that the spectatorship can never be passive. He writes, as it happened finally in all the enlightenment of modern times with the French Revolution, that terrible farce, quite superfluous when judged close at hand, into which, however, the noble and visionary spectators of all Europe had interpreted from a distance their own indignation and enthusiasm for so long and passionately, until the text had disappeared under the interpretation. The act of looking is accompanied by the work of interpretation. To Nietzsche's mind, the strength of the German interpretation is such that it overpowers the French text of revolution. So while France experienced the political revolution, Germany underwent a revolution in thought. The combined forces of Kantian philosophy and German idealism represented an intellectual upheaval which paralleled the political turbulence in France. Heinrich Heine would later worry that only our most distant descendants will be able to decide whether we should be praised or reproached for first working out our philosophy before working out our revolution. But other writers did not so much see a parallelism as a hierarchy. This is
no.
no, it's not.
Oh, no, it is.
No, it's okay. It's working in. I don't know what happened. There was a lag. Sorry. So this is Schlegel, Friedrich Schlegel. The French Revolution, Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre and Goethe's Wilhelm Meister are the greatest tendencies of the age. Whoever is offended by this juxtaposition, whoever takes seriously only a revolution that is noisy and materialistic, has still not elevated himself to the broader, higher perspective on the history of mankind. Even in our shabby cultural histories, which usually resemble a collection of variants with running commentary for a lost classical text, many a little book has played a larger role than anything done by the noisy multitude, who took no notice of it at that time. Friedrich Schlegel starts off by analogizing the different tendencies of the age, seeing Fichte's and Goethe's writings as the textual equivalents of political realities. But when he reflects self-consciously on the analogy, he introduces a distinction between mere political noise and the higher perspective of philosophy. Only a person who's not elevated himself to the insights of German thought would confuse the materialistic aims of the French revolutionaries with the world historical significance of German Romanticism. Moreover, the juxtaposition obscures temporal sequence and denies the French Revolution's role as the determinative stimulus for the development of German Romanticism. But Schlegel's account also anticipates Nietzsche's later textualization of the political event. More specifically, he philologizes it. Schlegel compares the French Revolution to a lost classical text, which has long since been eclipsed by the scholarly work of Reconstruction. The long history of establishing textual variants and producing commentaries comes to overshadow the absent original, just as Homer or Sophocles only really come into existence as the product of their scholarly afterlife. So the French Revolution is birthed by the reaction it provokes in German intellectual life. For Heine and others, Schlegel's commentary represents a defense mechanism, a psychological reaction to the realization of Germany's political backwardness. Karl Marx gave a name to this defensiveness, die deutsche Misere. We are the philosophical contemporaries of the age, Marx writes, without being the historical contemporaries. In a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, he elaborates. The struggle against the German political present is the struggle against the past of modern nations, which continue to be harassed by reminiscence of this past. It is instructive for them to see the ancient regime, which in their countries has experienced its tragedy, play its comic role as a German phantom. Marx here is drawing on Hegel's aesthetics and the historical sequence he charts in the evolution of literary history. Just as tragedy in Hegel's scheme represents a stage in a generic evolution towards comedy, the French Revolution is the tragic precursor to Germany's current farce. Yes, that's fine. So the modern Ancien Régime is merely the clown Marx, of a world order whose real heroes are dead. History is thorough and passes through many stages while bearing an ancient form to its grave. The last stage of a world historical form is its comedy. The Greek gods, who already died once of their wounds in Aeschylus's tragedy Prometheus Bound, were forced to die a second death, this time a comic one in Lucian's dialogues. Why does history take this course? So that mankind may part happily with its past. We claimed this happy historical destiny for the powers of Germany. So in figuring the German Ancien Régime of the 1840s as the parodic repetition of the rule of Louis XVI, the old order's original tragic end, which took place in France, must now take place in comic form in Germany. First time as Aeschylus, second time as Lucian. While Nietzsche interprets the French Revolution as a farce which only his German birth of tragedy can remedy, Marx sees German intellectual life as the farce which encapsulates its defensive reaction to the real tragedy of France. This is the first place in Marx's work that he employs the combined tropes of history repeating itself and the language of ancient genres. His much more famous usage of it comes a decade later at the opening of his analysis of a different French Revolution in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. There he writes, famously, Hegel remarks somewhere that all great world historical facts and personages occur as it were twice. He has forgotten to add the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. The exact source of Hegel's comments about the compulsive repetition of history remains somewhat obscure, but the influence of Hegel on Marx's historical tropology here is clear. From his useful theological essays through the phenomenology to his aesthetics and the philosophy of right, the Hegelian dialectic, which is with its movement through thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, is explicitly connected to Hegel's analysis of tragedy. In these passages, Marx brings Hegel's tragic dialectic into contact with his aesthetic theories of the evolution of genre. Yet while he follows Hegel's narrative of temporal evolution, he reverses his valuation of the respective genres. For while Hegel's repeated references to tragedy speak to his admiration, he nevertheless places comedy at a higher stage in the development of spirit. Comedy is associated by Hegel with the advent of subjectivity. Subjectivity describes the moment when the self elevates itself above objectivity, passive adherence to social norms, and achieves a higher state of self-consciousness. Marx, by contrast, clearly sees tragic action as a more authentic analog for the movement of history. Configuring first Germany and then Louis Bonaparte as the comic counterparts to the French revolutionary heroes, he clearly intends to diminish their claim to world historical significance. Such an implicit hierarchy lies behind his later reference to tragedy in the 18th Brumaire. He writes, unheroic as bourgeois society is, it nevertheless took the heroism, self-sacrifice, terror, civil war, and battles to bring it into being. And in the classically austere traditions of the Roman Republic, its gladiators found the ideals and the art forms, the self-deceptions that they needed in order to conceal from themselves the bourgeois limitations of the content of their struggles and to maintain their passions on the high plane of great historical tragedy. Here we have a picture by David, which combines the references to the kind of austere classical traditions, but also to the kind of tragic theme of revolution. And we'll talk about it now. Let's come back to the questions. I'm very happy to. So this passage spells out Marx's ultimate disillusion with the 1789 revolution. The contents of its struggles turned out to be limited to establishing the bourgeoisie rather than delivering on their promise of human emancipation. Yet it was the classical traditions of the Roman Republic and the grandiose form of tragedy which enabled its actors to deceive themselves. They were involved in acts of heroism. Louis Bonaparte, by contrast, is involved in a different level of self-deception. Like his more famous uncle, he reaches back to antiquity for an ancient art form, but instead of tragic heroism, he finds debased farce. Thus, this is Marx again, thus the resurrection of the dead in those revolutions serves the purpose of glorifying the new struggles, not of parodying the old, of magnifying the task in the imagination, not of fleeing from its solution in reality, of finding once again the spirit of revolution, not making its ghost walk about again. While the appeal to antiquity in 1789 was an attempt to find once more the spirit of revolution, in the coup of 1851, it had become an act of necromancy. Marx would return to this same conjunction of historical repetition and dramatic metaphor a third time in the 1860s. He now turns his attention away from the European revolutions to the New World. In a structure that is familiar from the 18th Brumaire, Marx compares the advances of the American Revolution to the Emancipation Proclamation issued by Lincoln almost a century later in 1863. As Marx writes in an article in Die Presse, Lincoln's proclamation is even more important than the Maryland campaign. Lincoln is a sui generis figure in the annals of history. He has no initiative, no idealistic impetus, no Cothurnus, no historical trappings. He gives his most important actions always the most commonplace form. His latest proclamation, which is drafted in the same style, the Manifesto Abolishing Slavery, is the most important document in American history since the establishment of the Union, tantamount to the tearing up of the old American Constitution. Unlike the heroes of the French Revolution, Lincoln did not perform the task of his time in Roman costumes and with Roman phrases. He neither looked back to the past to recover the spirit of revolution, nor did he attempt to resurrect the dead. Throwing off the Cothurnus of tragedy, he adopts a commonplace form. He thus eschews the rhetorical trappings of both his European counterparts, as well as the original actors of the American Revolution. It goes on. Nothing is simpler than to show that Lincoln's principal political actions contain much that is aesthetically repulsive, logically inadequate, farcical in form, and politically contradictory, as is done by the English Pindars of slavery, the Times, the Saturday Review, and Tutti Quanti. But Lincoln's place in the history of the United States and of mankind will nevertheless be next to that of Washington. Nowadays, when the insignificant struts about melodramatically on this side of the Atlantic, is it not of significance at all that the significance is closed in everyday dress in the New World? The New World has never achieved a greater triumph than by this demonstration that, given its political and social organization, ordinary people of goodwill can accomplish feats that only heroes could accomplish in the old world. Hegel once observed that comedy is in act superior to tragedy, and humorous reasons superior to grandiloquent reasoning. Although Lincoln does not possess the grandiloquence of historical action, as an average man of the people, he has its humor. So the farcical form of Lincoln's political intervention should not mask the revolutionary content of his actions. By clothing themselves in ancient dress, both the original French revolutionaries and Louis Bonaparte were involved in self-deception. Yet it was Louis Bonaparte's specifically farcical rather than tragic reenactment which exposed the bad faith of his actions. Lincoln, by contrast, embraces the popular form of comedy, but reveals action at its most authentic. The American Revolution may have shared the bourgeois limitations of its French successor, yet in declaring the end of slavery, Lincoln was involved in a genuine quest for human emancipation. Marx seems to have a new name for the kind of performance he finds most troubling and insincere: melodrama. Melodrama is the genre which cloaks itself in tragic grandeur, but unwittingly becomes farce. It has none of the purity of the two great dramatic genres to emerge from antiquity. It also has none of the ancient pedigree of its generic counterparts. Indeed, as Peter Brooks argues, the melodramatic imagination was fundamentally tied up with the experience of modernity. Emerging as a self-conscious genre during the course of the 19th century, melodrama for Marx spoke to the existential malaise of the old world. Melodrama, as Brooks notes, emerged as a genre in France in the aftermath of the revolution. It is thus in its essence a post-revolutionary genre, the generic shrug to the failed tragedy of the revolution. In Marx's third use of the theatrical trope, the reference to Hegel's analysis of genre becomes explicit. Staying close to the Hegelian text, he reverses his previous valuation of tragedy and comedy. Lincoln's homespun humor is presented as the true revolutionary answer to old Europe's tragedy. It is comedy's relationship to the people which recasts tragedy as the genre of outmoded aristocracy. Rather than rejecting classical genres as such, Marx deploys them strategically to create a contrast between authentic and inauthentic action. The problem with Germany of 1843, the problem with Louis Bonaparte in 1851, and the problem with the old world of the 1860s was not one of form, but one of content. Comedy looks like farce in the old world, but in the new world, where Lincoln is upholding the government of the people, by the people, for the people, it can be returned to its Athenian democratic lineage. Famous passage, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. And just when they seem engaged in revolutionizing themselves and things, in creating something that has never yet existed, precisely in such periods of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service and borrow from them names, battle cries, and costumes in order to present the new scene of world history in this time-honored disguise and this borrowed language. In the old Europe, the classical genres of tragedy and comedy can only be experienced as a borrowed language. Steeped in classical learning and reverence for the past, European actors experience these dead generations as a nightmare. Unlike these insignificants who strut on this side of the Atlantic, Lincoln, in Marx's eyes, was unencumbered by tradition, not weighed down by a historical sense. Yet it is he who finds once more the spirit of revolution and returns history in comic form back to life and action. In Frank Ruder's suggestive terms, Lincoln hews himself to comedy's deathlessness. From the 1840s to the 1860s, from Paris to Gettysburg, Marx's understanding of revolutionary action is shot through with dramatic metaphors. Writing half a century after the French Revolution, Marx was able to watch its unfolding as a spectacle. Yet this spectacularization of revolution was not limited to its distant observers. The revolutionaries themselves were aware of the dramatic dimension of their actions. At the heart of the revolutionary theatre was the guillotine. The act of beheading was accompanied by a series of self-conscious theatrical devices. The procession of the tumbril conveying prisoners, the orchestrated approach to the scaffold, the hush of the crowd, and the display of the severed head. Yet the terror brought its own paradox, as the efficiency of the guillotine threatened to eliminate its theatrical potential. As the Restif de la Bretonne is said to have remarked, there is no tragedy for them, they don't have the time to be moved. When Marat boasted to Camille Desmoulins that he would strike down 500, 5,000, 20,000 in a heartbeat, Desmoulins responded, Desmoulins responded, Monsieur Marat, you are the dramaturg of journalism. The Danaids and the Brahmases are nothing besides your tragedies. You slit the throat of every character in the play, right down to the prompter. You are unaware then that excess in tragedy goes flat. So the measured grandeur of Greek tragedy has given way to a Senecan celebration of violence. In its marrying of theatricalization and violence, the terror marks the limit point of revolution's spectacular politics. Yet from Desmoulins to Marx, we witness a weariness with spectacle which substitutes for a denunciation of revolutionary violence. There is a desire to be done with theatricalization. The revolution will not be televised. For as Marx writes of his future communist revolution, the former revolutions required recollections of past world history in order to smother their own content. The revolution of the 19th century must let the dead bury their dead in order to arrive at its own content. There the phrase went beyond content, here the content goes beyond the phrase. But as Derrida shows, the problem with theatre is not with the antiquatedness of its form, it is with form itself. This is Derrida in Spectres of Marx, but this time the inadequation will stem from the excess of its own content with regard to the phrase. The own content will no longer frighten, it will not hide itself, driven back behind the bereaved rhetoric, antique models, and the grimace of the death masked. It will exceed the form, it will break out of its clothes, it will overtake signs, models, eloquence, mourning. Nothing there will be any longer an effective mannerism, giving itself airs. No more credit and no more borrowed figure. The revolutionary actor will need to disrobe, remove his cothurnus and clad himself in everyday dress in order to be true to the contents of this new revolution. Lincoln's act of emancipation brings to light the sham emancipation of Europe's bourgeois revolutions. Yet even when he breaks out of his clothes, he merely abandons one ancient form to inhabit another. Lincoln's authentic act is achieved not by abandoning form, but by moving scene and switching genre. The comedy of the New World stands as the solution to the tragedy of the Ancien Régime. So this is part 2, tragedy of emancipation. In Lincoln, Marx discovers a comic rather than a tragic actor whose revolutionary actions, the abolition of slavery, are the authentic expression of popular comedy. But Marx's focus on Lincoln signals more than a transition from tragedy to comedy. The setting of the New World and the question of emancipation itself opens up a new metaphorical register. Susan Buck-Morse writes, by the 18th century, slavery had become the root metaphor of Western political philosophy, connoting everything that was evil about power relations. Freedom, its conceptual antithesis, was considered by Enlightenment thinkers as the highest and universal political value. Yet, as Buck-Morse continues, this political metaphor began to take root at precisely the time that the economic practice of slavery, the systematic, highly sophisticated capitalist enslavement of non-Europeans as a labor force in the colonies, was increasing quantitatively and intensifying qualitatively, to the point that by the mid-18th century, it came to underwrite the entire economic system of the West, paradoxically facilitating the global spread of the very Enlightenment ideals that were in such fundamental contradiction to it. If it is Hegel's philosophy of history which gives form to Marx's dialectical materialism, it is his master-slave dialectic which lends its contents. For Hegel, the struggle to death between master and slave provides the key to the unfolding of freedom in world history. In asking where Hegel's dialectic originated, scholarly consensus has looked to antiquity. So George Armstrong Perry writes, in the background always and at the surface much of the time, Hegel is wrestling with problems of Greek antiquity and seeking both to overcome them and to externalize them in an alien climate. The Platonic parallel between struggles in the state and struggles in the soul is never far distant. For Judith Sklar, the obvious reference is to Aristotle's Politics and its discussion of natural slavery and mastership. Insisting on the reference to ancient slavery and furthermore exploring this institution through the philosophical writings of Plato and Aristotle, scholars have conspired to obscure the contemporary in Hegel's writings on slavery. Hegel's slavery is first ancient and then therefore abstract and structural. The dual focus on antiquity and abstraction ironically finds a parallel in the Marxian reception of the master-slave dynamic. Recall the opening passage of the Communist Manifesto. The history of all hitherto existing societies, the history of class struggle, free man and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstruction of society at large or in the common ruin of contending classes. The ancient Greek freeman and slave, who stand at the origin of this power struggle, are metamorphosed into the social structures first of Rome, then of medieval Europe, and then of the Renaissance. But what starts out as a historical progression soon becomes a conceptual progression as free man and slave morphs into the universal oppressor and oppressed. While Marx grounds his response to the phenomenology in a critique of this abstraction, it is Marx's own abstraction of the master-slave dialectic which seals Hegel's alienation from his contemporary moment. As Buck-Morse observes, the phenomenology of spirit was written in Jena in 1805-6, which was the first year of the Haitian nation's existence, and published in 1807, the year of the British abolition of the slave trade. Despite the insistent focus on antiquity in scholarly discussions of lordship and bondage section, Buck-Morse is certainly not alone in seeing Hegel's philosophy as closely engaged with his own historical moment. To quote Charles Arthur, Hegel was born in 1770 and died in 1831. Thus, he lived through the most revolutionary epoch in the world had yet seen: the overthrow of the old regime in France, the revolutionary wars of Napoleon, his defeat, the Restoration. In fact, the fact is that Hegel's philosophy, even at its most abstruse, is in continual dialogue with the real historical movement, movements everyone recognizes. If then it is commonplace to think of Hegel's philosophy as a reaction to the experience of revolution, the question then becomes, which revolution? In writing about the master-slave dialectic, Buck-Morse argues, Hegel highlights how the struggle for political emancipation in the French Revolution had a parallel in the Haitian slave revolt. In fact, she argues events in San Domingo were central to contemporary attempts to make sense out of the reality of the French Revolution and its aftermath. Far from being an epiphenomenon to the French Revolution, the Haitian slave revolt became a privileged site for working through its hopes and contradictions. Such centrality was achieved largely despite rather than because of the French revolutionaries' own efforts. Although the metaphor of slavery was absolutely central to the mantras of the French Revolution, the question of the persistence of actual slavery in its colonies was only half-heartedly addressed in the metropole. The French colonies were governed by le Code Noir, which was established under Louis XIV in 1685 and not definitively abolished until 1848. The code legalized the institution of slavery, but also the branding, torture, and killing of slaves who attempted to revolt. Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains, so writes Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But for all Rousseau's revulsion from slavery, he never mentions le Code Noir. Neither does Diderot, although the condemnation of the slave trade in the Encyclopédie was forthright. Let the colonies be destroyed rather than be the cause of so much evil, he writes there. As C.L.R. James comments, such outbursts neither then nor now have carried weight, and wordy attacks against slavery drew sneers from observers, which were not altogether undeserved. The authors were compared to doctors who offered to a patient nothing more than invectives against the disease which consumed him. When we turn to the actors of the French Revolution, the picture is equally ambivalent. Jean-Paul Marat's bestseller, Les chaînes de l'esclavage, furthered Republican aspirations in France, yet, as Srinivas Aravamudan points out, the reputedly radical treatise is remarkable for the ease with which it uses the word esclavage to discuss metropolitan politics while being completely oblivious to the colonial reference of the word, at a moment close to the pinnacle of plantation slavery and the slave trade. Meanwhile, Robespierre, aware of the appropriation of the term esclavage, used it to describe the domestic situation and instead used the euphemism unfree persons to describe slavery in the colonies. The most prominent anti-slavery group was the Amis des Noirs, established in 1788. Although it was a small group, it included the influential figures Brissot, Condorcet, and Mirabeau. Through their pamphlets and speeches, they succeeded in making the condition of the slaves a subject of debate amongst the revolutionaries. After Louis XVI convoked the États Généraux, San Domingan slave proprietors took the novel step of demanding representation. After the Third Estate was locked out of the meeting at Versailles and disbanded to the tennis court, the San Domingans followed them. They were in turn granted representation by the bourgeoisie, who feared the economic consequences of their exclusion. Incensed, Mirabeau turned on them. He wrote, and he said, "You claim representation proportionate to the number of inhabitants. The free blacks are proprietors and taxpayers, and yet they have not been allowed to vote. As for the slaves, either they are men or they are not. If the colonists consider them to be men, let them be free and make them electors and eligible for seats. If the contrary is the case, have we, in apportioning deputies according to the population of France, taken into consideration the number of our horses and our mules?" Mirabeau thus exposed the hypocrisy of the racial bias of the fight for freedom. The unfolding of the logic of freedom in the colonies threatened to unravel the total institutional framework of the slave economy that supported such a substantial part of the French bourgeoisie, whose political revolution, of course, this was. But rather than the activities of the Amis des Noirs in Paris, it was the actions of the slaves of San Domingo which made the question of slavery central to revolutionary politics. In 1791, 500,000 slaves organized a violent revolt in San Domingo, the largest and richest French colony. As Aravamudan puts it, the black slaves themselves realized that if metaphorical slaves could revolt, literal ones ought not to be left behind. As a result, slavery was abolished on the island in 1793, and a year later, in 1794, the revolutionary government abolished slavery throughout the French colonies. Rather than being the result of proactive campaigning by the Parisian revolutionaries, the abolition came about in response to the events on the ground in the colonies. In fact, the abolition was an emergency measure to prevent the British occupation of the island. In his groundbreaking account of the events in San Domingo, C.L.R. James coined the term Black Jacobins to describe the revolting slaves. He thus marks out the intimate connection between the struggle for political emancipation in Paris and the slave struggle for literal emancipation in the colonies. It is an irony that the cause of abolition was heavily associated with the Girondin wing of the revolution rather than the Jacobins, who never played an active part in the cause of abolition. In highlighting the slaves' loyalty to the ideals of revolution, James's narrative brings to the fore the tragic predicament of their revolution. True to the spirit of that revolution, they found themselves betrayed by its actors. James's work focuses on the figure of Toussaint L'Ouverture. Little is known for sure about his childhood and background. He's thought to have been born on the plantation of Breda. Pierre Baptiste, a freed slave who lived on the plantation, was his godfather and is said to have taught him French and educated him in the European classics. C.L.R. James follows others in attributing Toussaint's political awakening to his early reading of the Abbé Raynal's encyclopedic Histoire philosophique et politique des établissements et du commerce des Européens dans les 2 Indes, which was first published in 1770. It was a very important Enlightenment work, which was co-authored by James. And there, in Black Jacobin, James imagines the young Toussaint reading its most famous passage. If then, ye nations of Europe, interest alone can exert its influence over you, listen to me once more. Your slaves stand in no need either of your generosity or your counsels in order to break the sacrilegious yoke of their oppression. Nature speaks a more powerful language than philosophy or interests. Already have 2 colonies of fugitive Negroes been established, to whom treaties and powers give a perfect security from your attempts. There are so many indications of the impending storm, the Negroes only want a chief sufficiently courageous to lead them on to vengeance and slaughter. Where is this great man whom nature owes to her afflicted, oppressed, and tormented children? Where is he? He will undoubtedly appear. He will show himself. He will lift up the sacred standard of liberty. This venerable signal will collect around him the companions of his misfortunes. They will rush on with more impetuosity than torrents. They will leave behind them in all parts indelible traces of their just resentment. In all parts, the name of the hero who shall have restored the rights of human species will be blessed. In all parts, trophies will be erected to his glory. Then will the black code be no more, and the white code will be a dreadful one, if the conqueror only regards the right of reprisals. James comments, over and over again, Toussaint read this passage. A courageous chief was wanted. It is the tragedy of mass movements that they need and can only rarely find adequate leadership. Although the scene of Toussaint reading the so-called Black Spartacus passage is probably apocryphal, for James, as for others, the debt to the French Enlightenment becomes a cornerstone of the history of Haitian nationalism. As Aramudan observes, whereas in myth, the national hero leads his people out of bondage according to a preconceived plan communicated by divine revelation, evident in abortive rebellions of the Sierra Leone settlers, whose rhetoric harked back to Exodus. The narrative of the secular nation state prefers the revolutionary pamphlet as the more acceptable call to arms. This spectacle of literary epiphany is not represented in altogether triumphalist tones. This is the first of several references to tragedy that punctuate James's account of the Haitian Revolution. For James, what is at stake here is the question of heroism and the relationship between the hero and the masses. Indeed, James will repeatedly return to the language of tragedy to describe the vexed relationship between revolutionary readers and the people they purport to represent. In an influential argument, David Scott has criticized James for what he calls a romantic notion of historiography, that is to say, an inclination to privilege the historic roles of heroic personality. Scott draws on Hayden White's distinction between romantic and tragic modes of historical emplotment. In Hayden White's schema, the romance, I quote, is fundamentally a drama of self-identification, symbolized by the hero's transcendence over the world of experience, his victory over it, and final liberation from it. Tragedy, like comedy, allows some level of reconciliation between the hero and his environment. As White suggests, quote, in tragedy, the reconciliations are much more somber. They are more in the nature of the resignations of men to the conditions in which they must labor in the world. These conditions, in turn, are asserted to be inalterable and eternal, and the implication is that man cannot change them, but must work within them. Toussaint's chosen name, L'Ouverture, speaks to Scott's identification of him as a romantic hero. In his ability to open up the future, Toussaint embodies the Arendtian natal. No surprise, then, that the figure of Toussaint was heavily lionized by the Romantics, the subject of a sonnet by Wordsworth, amongst others. Scott argues James' perspective on the revolution had changed between the original publication of Black Jacobins in 1938 and the second edition of 1963. In particular, he highlights, quote, the new conceptual space he assigns to tragedy, which emerges as a result of contemporary historical events and changes in James's own identity. Yet, as the reference above to tragedy shows, even in the first edition, there are signs that James was writing in a tragic rather than a romantic key. The theatrical dimension to the first edition would not come as a surprise, as James's historiographical classic was actually the reworking of his 1934 play, Toussaint L'Ouverture. Yet this passage speaks to the romantic heroism of Toussaint, while semantically introducing the vocabulary of tragedy. But he immediately follows the scene of political awakening with a speculation on the dialectic between the individual and the masses, a dialectic which he describes as tragic. More a Greek tragic hero than a romantic one, Toussaint could not avoid a dialogue with the chorus. Such a perspective on ancient tragedy was key to James's understanding of the genre. James saw the invention of tragedy as an expression of democratic politics and identified the chorus as representatives of the people. This is James from a different essay. The tragic hero was a distinguished man. He usually suffered from some weakness, a kind of personal pride to which the Greeks gave a special name, hybris. And any man who sought too much power, too much distinction to remove himself from the normal, then the tragic destiny was likely to fall upon him. It was a warning to democracy to maintain a certain balance, a certain proportion. This curtailing of individual agency by the collective is associated by James with the further determinism of economic structures. So James follows this passage with a broader analysis of historical agency. He writes, men make their own history, and the Black Jacobins of San Domingo were to make history which would alter the fate of millions of men and shift the economic currents of 3 continents. But if they could seize opportunity, they could not create it. The slave trade and slavery were woven tight into the economics of the 18th century. 3 forces, the proprietors of San Domingo, the French bourgeoisie, and the British bourgeoisie, throve on the devastation of a continent and on the brutal exploitation of millions. As long as these maintained an equilibrium, the infernal traffic would go on, and for that matter would have gone on until the present day. But nothing, however profitable, goes on forever. From the very moment of their development, colonial planters, French and British bourgeois, were generating internal stresses and intensifying external rivalries, moving blindly to explosions and conflicts which would shatter the basis of their dominance and create the possibility of emancipation. Deliberately echoing Marx's 18th Brumaire, James follows Marx in linking the question of tragedy to the debate about structure and agency in history. Here, James takes up a theme he first proposes in his preface to the first edition. Great men make history, but only such history as it is possible for them to make. The freedom of achievement is limited by the necessities of their environment. The German idealist reading of tragedy as a conflict between freedom and necessity subtends James's narratives here. In James's historiography of revolution, the dialectic between individual and masses is allied to the tension between individual volition and social determinism. In the 18th Brumaire, Marx immediately follows his reflection on the tragic comic course of history with his observation that revolutionaries made their own history, but not in circumstances of their choosing. He articulates the extent to which individual and even collective actions are scripted in words, languages, and genres which pre-exist them. For Marx, this limitation has a specifically ancient dimension. The classical genre of tragedy, the heroism of the Roman republicanism. These are the traditions of the dead generations which weigh like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Toussaint's tropical revolution experiences another level of curtailment. The Black Jacobins would make their own history, but in a language they borrowed from the metropole. When this subaltern speaks, he can only speak French. For James, this is the specific location of Toussaint's tragic identity. This is the most famous tragic quote from Black Jacobins. The defeat of Toussaint in the War of Independence and his imprisonment and death in Europe are universally looked upon as a tragedy. They contain the authentic elements of the tragic in that even at the height of the war, Toussaint strove to maintain the French connection as necessary to Haiti in its long and difficult climb to civilization. His allegiance to the French Revolution and all it opened out for mankind in general, the people of San Domingo in particular, this had made him what he was, but this in the end ruined him. If Toussaint's reading of Leonard inaugurates his entry into European enlightenment, his confrontation with Napoleon brings it to its tragic denouement. Toussaint had fought for emancipation as a Jacobin, yet he was to see himself re-enslaved by the French, ending his life in a French prison. When Napoleon came to power in 1799, he passed a new constitution which declared that the colonies would be subject to special laws. Napoleon initially sent reassurances that he would not reintroduce slavery. Toussaint was keen to reassure Napoleon of his loyalty, but at the same time drew on a constitution for the whole island, which, while falling short of calling for independence, was detrimental to French interests. As a result, Napoleon sent an army to San Domingo to restore French authority. Toussaint had to choose between the return to slavery or San Domingo without France. His vacillations in the ensuing War of Independence are identified by James as his hamartia. Despite the overt reference to Aristotle, the reference to hamartia, James's tragic conception is more Hegelian than Aristotelian. Toussaint's predicament is the personification of tragic conflict. He embodies a social crisis, the collision of embattled and irreconcilable forces. Toussaint embodies the collision of, on the one hand, the old order of slave plantations, San Domingo, and on the other, the new order represented by the Enlightenment ideals of revolutionary France. As James's first reference to tragedy reveals, his tragedy is specifically the tragedy of colonial modernity. It encapsulates both the tension between individual elites oriented towards Europe and the masses they represent, and the experience of performing the task of their time in a borrowed language. As David Scott concludes, the Black Jacobins is not only about the profound connection between tragedy and modernity for someone like Toussaint L'Ouverture, it is about the ways in which for someone like Toussaint L'Ouverture, the modern is confronted as a tragic condition, a condition in which there are, as James puts it, only tragic alternatives. Marx thought that by turning away from Europe to the New World, he could leave behind tragic bourgeois revolutions, discover a comedy of human emancipation. Assessing the aftermath of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, W.E. Du Bois could only discover, I quote, tragedy that beggared the Greek. Scott traces a post-colonial awareness in James that romantic struggles of emancipation contains the seeds of their tragic aftermath, or as Aimé Césaire observed, la libération c'est épique, mais les noms deviennent tragiques. Liberation is epic, but its aftermaths are tragic. Tragedy and emancipation are inextricably linked. Tragedy, as the Greeks knew, is the genre of transition. It is the genre that comes to life when the Athenians endeavored to express the novelty of their social and political structures in their difficult confrontation with the old. Athenian tragedians are like Marx's revolutionaries, who, just as they seem to be occupied with revolutionizing themselves and things, creating something that did not exist before, anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service. It is the realization of novelty which produces anxiety. Tragedy's philosophy is, in Simon Critchley's phrase, the dangerous perhaps. In thinking about tragedy and revolution, perhaps we ought to shift our understanding, as Alberto Toscano suggests in he's saying Frank's latest special issue. He writes there that we should shift our understanding of tragedy from the register of spectacular defeat and of collective sacrifice to that of patient critique.
Thank you very much, Miriam. This was fascinating. I would immediately open the floor to people online or here. I can kickstart it off, but maybe there's any immediate question where someone wants to jump in. No, I'm just going to start with one point, and then I think I would have others, but I was wondering about the sequence 70, 89, 80, 51, 1863, right, that you talked about in Marx. So 70, 81, it seems like it looks like one can be still authentically tragic, right? So if I understand correctly, it's a revolutionary attempt, and it sort of just fails. And terror is a symptom of it, or is how it fails, because it doesn't find a way to deal with it. And 1851 is different because it restages failure. It brings up another Napoleon, one that Marx thought was clownish or grotesque, and very and there it's not even tragic anymore. So it has all the elements that Hegel seemed to have identified in comedy, but in no longer doing what Hegel thought comedy. If I understood your reconstruction correctly, so 1851, he seems to be thinking both forms sort of have lost their potential, right? So the revolution doesn't work, even the revolution is a tragic form, and something doesn't work anymore, and even worse, not even the comedy works. It became farcical. And then the Lincoln example is, or the Lincoln discussion is really interesting because, I mean, at one point you said, moving across the switching genre is what Lincoln somehow does with that dilemma, right? He displaces it and reshuffles it. And the question is, how does that work for Marx? I mean, the intuitive idea I had when listening to you was, it is almost like he thinks one can dialecticize that again, right? So tragedy is exhausted or saturated, comedy is exhausted, but if one does something with it, maybe one can salvage something of comedy and salvage something of tragedy. And that is weirdly Lincoln. The revolution without idealism. The abolishment without pathos. And it's still weirdly, he's speaking an old a borrowed language. Right? What is it? Do you think that is the problem that then comes out? And is that reconstruction? Would you agree with that, or is that what the yeah?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think absolutely that is the sequence. But it's interesting that at both stages he introduces a kind of third term. So farce, right, is not comedy, but it's in the place of, in the Hegelian scheme, it has to be sitting in the place of comedy. And then when the Lincoln example, he uses melodrama as his antithesis. So it's neither comedy nor tragedy. I mean, he says, and so that's interesting that in each case he needs to introduce a third term, or a term which isn't which salvages the ancient genres in some form or another. Yeah. And it's that kind of weird reclaim or sort of what's the word I'm looking for? But the sort of I mean, in the way that farce turns ancient even though Marx sees the limitations of the content of the 1789 revolution, he still wants to valorize its form in a way by calling it tragedy. And yes, it's tragic because it's a failure, but at the same time, in giving it the name tragedy, he is sort of elevating it. And then in a sense, by using the kind of term melodrama, ancient comedy then looks like it's a form that could be possible. And yet, when Marx talks about, in the 18th Brumaire, when Marx talks about what he calls the social revolution, or the communist revolution, he says that it will not speak the poetry of the past, and that's the passage about the content going beyond the form and so on. So he aspires to a kind of formless revolution, and yet in his discussion, he's always looking at these kind of relative terms in which actually the ancient genres are in some ways rehabilitated. And that's what I find quite interesting, that there's a way in which they, and so on the one hand, he's incredibly critical of this idea of a borrowed language. At the same time, he sees in a way no escape from borrowed language, and I think that's what's, because I think in his characterization of Lincoln is actually quite close to a kind of ancient comedic model. It is a kind of Aristophanes model. It's not that he's when he says he takes his clothes off, he talks about the Cathurnus, which is explicitly tragic. It's the idea of the kind of, the comic individual who is in plain clothes and so on. And again, sort of quite interestingly, Lincoln was a melancholic. He was a kind of tragic figure. So to see Marx emphasizing his comedic dimension or his humor is sort of very, and again there it's interesting that he uses humor. What does that mean? How does humor relate to comedy? So yeah, but that was really
maybe one can, I mean, just sorry, and then please just brace your end or make yourself known, because maybe, as you indicated, maybe there is no other than a borrowed language. Right? There's this not especially great joke about that a guy in Stalin's Russia who was sent to the Gulag, and before he's sent to the Gulag, he tells all his friends that he will send letters, but his letters will be certainly surveilled. So everything that he actually means, he will write in red ink, and everything else he will write in blue ink. And so his friends receive, after he's in the Gulag, the first letter, and he basically says, dear friends, I must say I'm surprised. The weather is great. The labor is really, really vitalizing. And the food is not bad. And everyone is so pleasant. I have found many friends. The only thing missing is red ink. And so somehow, and I think that joke points out that sometimes being aware of what is missing, I mean, the language in which one expresses what is missing almost, right, is a way of then doing something. So I was thinking when you were reconstructing that Lincoln example, it is almost like the proletarian revolution that creates a deadlock and then has to reinvent itself and creates another deadlock, right? And it's not just like jumping from success to success, but it gets bogged down with issues, and the borrowed forms return somehow. Then the question is probably how to reinvent that. How to speak a borrowed language in a new way.
And I think that's the sort of conclusion that I come to in the end, that there is no escape, that you switch, as I say, what he essentially does is he switches scene. He changes the scene. We're now in the new world, and that's where it's. And I do think there's something to in a kind of in that sort of idea of the kind of Nietzschean idea of the lack of historical sense of the world, and how the reference to kind of classical models might look different in the New World to the Old World.
I was wondering, so it seems like both definitely for the old world, there's this step tragedy and comedy, but both kind of fail. And then maybe in the new world there's a new chance for comedy. But then if I recall correctly, at one point you were saying even in Marx's model, it's like time, it's tied to antiquity and it's abstract. And then you went on to like, well, there's this big new problem for emancipatory struggle, and that's how can you think the freedom of slaves? And then in the end, it's definitely leaning very strongly towards this is a tragic paradigm. And I wonder if there's any role for a comic paradigm in this as well, or if it's just not. I mean, it's a bit strange because this is already in the past, so it's hard to say. Was there some missing view of the comic in here, or is there something that hasn't happened yet that has to happen in the future that can only be thought through comedy? Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, it reconstructed very well, I think better than I did how that link to the kind of abstraction into antiquity plays through in that case. And I mean, the example I gave was Du Bois saying that for him Lincoln is a tragedy that begged the grave, right? That the Emancipation Proclamation for him is a tragedy. There's nothing comic about it, and so there you have exactly that sort of sense in which what for Marx has the potential for the lived experience of the slaves. It turned into a tragedy, and so. Yeah, I think I suppose inherent in your question is that it would be to follow Marx's logic that comedy is inherently a more it is somehow redemptive in some form. Yeah, and I'm not if we cycle back to the earlier texts, comedy there is the debasement of tragedy, and so yes, it's interesting that in Lincoln that's where it goes, but I think there is a sense in which there is a concern, to go back to what we were saying before, that both of them have they can sort of appear in a never-ending sequence, but it's still a sequence in which one overcomes the other, and then the comedy isn't necessarily the root out of that sequence. I think is how I think about it. But maybe, and then someone like Scott brings in the kind of concept of a romantic. As a romantic version, and there's the epic. There's a notion of epic. Is epic a way out of it? Or I did a little bit of work on also sort of on satire. Is satire, so you can sort of play around with kind of generic modes to see whether you can sort of see yourself out of this dualism of a tragedy and comedy. But in a way, I'm not sure. I mean, the argument I make is that actually, I don't think James ever actually has a romantic vision here. I think it's tragic through and through, and that is it's not a sort of move in his position. I think he thinks that it was the Rome that I mean, you could argue that tragedy is inherent to a romantic narrative too, in a way, and that's sort of what he argued.
Yeah, it's hard for me to reconcile the genre motive analysis and the periodization that it assumes, at least when we're looking at, I guess, literary forms of tragedy and so on. So we look at the Greek period and so on. In the case of, for instance, the parallel histories of Columbus, for example, and Toussaint, in the way that C.L.R. James kind of prologues the entire history with this kind of dry, almost kind of geographical or geopolitical account of the situation, and then sort of the real history begins with the revolution, or the humanity of the revolution is represented in the revolutionary, or the humanity behind this history is represented behind the revolutionary hero. And I think a way for me to reframe that, because the really bizarre and interesting aspect of Columbus's own journey is this, I don't know, conscription of a weird like humorousness in his expedition, that he also had a kind of a literary epiphany that he was the one to restore Jerusalem, or there was this entire larger project of colonialism that wasn't I mean, it wasn't outside of slavery, but it wasn't necessarily also predicated on slavery. I mean, there seemed to be a broader telos under which slavery was a kind of a moment, or which, I mean, a very long one, which then subrupted the entire project. And so there's maybe this, to me, again, reconciling the question of periodicity and or the movement from tragedy to comedy and so on, or as a kind of a progression of forms. One can point to maybe like a certain riddling humorousness in tragedy itself. Like there's, one trips and falls to their death. I mean, is that tragic or funny, or is it like terrible, or is it in a way the disparity or conflict or opposition or two-sidedness of revolution and ideology? So Columbus's ideological naivety versus one's own revolutionary naivety, which kind of reproduces the form of the I do, like I shall do and I shall overcome and so on. That I think it would undercut, I'm sorry, this is a bit sporadic, but in a way I would want it to tie in the philosophical valences of this discussion, because precisely in philosophy you have the same reflection into ideology, but it's no longer a sort of a repetition of ideology in a naive sense. Whereas I think the revolutionary impetus, which is always, it has to be ideological, it has to be material, it has to be straightforward and kind of active, and then it reconciles with its own, blind sides. It's again, which contributes to the humorous element in what is tragic and so on. So I guess maybe, a generic way of putting the question would be, do you think there's actually a wider room for organizing these, the interactions between the realm of aesthetics, aesthetic representation of various generic forms, their historical outcomes, and then how we proceed as like autonomous subjects who sort of have everything configured for ourselves already, thanks to our predecessors and so. I mean, I don't know if that question settles itself anywhere, but yeah, I'm just sensing there are like disparate. We're classifying at the same time as we're trying to mobilize ourselves through these differences, and so maybe like this point of the tragic as already having place for, I think this is to make it like extremely trivial perhaps, but having it's in itself a place for the comic, and the comic as situated in the tragic in this precise way would involve a very bizarre and really almost non-communicable form of revolutionary practice, as for example you might find in like these outmoded versions of fanon, or these weird poetic acts of like refusal, which is not exactly basically a region of like a truly contentless, formless region that is kind of self-developing. Just
I mean, that's a lot of really interesting thoughts, which I think, yes, absolutely. I think this whole idea the porosity of the genres is very, very important and I think surely that's in a way where they get their explanatory power from, in a way that because they're not exclusionary in that sense. And I think I mean, you know, even in terms of literary history, that is true. You can see how, you know, there are very strong elements of comedy in ancient tragedy, and more so. I mean, the Euripides almost invents a kind of tragicomic genre, and so, but you know, in that probably only reveals what was already a potential. So, and you know, and in Antiquity, you've got the end of the Symposium where Plato imagines the possibility of both genres coinciding. So I think that, you know, with Plato, I suppose one gets that sense that question of their porosity becomes a question for philosophy very early on, and therefore there is that surely kind of animates the philosophical debate around them, that they come as a pair, and they come as a pair which needs to be thought about in their interrelation as well as their ability. But then I suppose the other question is about, you know, what work form does, you know, what work form does in terms of both not just organizing thought, but organizing revolutionary idealism and so on. And I think you know, I think it's a very, you know, I mean that the beginning of the 18th century is so interesting because it really gets to that question. It's not he moves from a philosophical question to a psychological explanation of what it is to be involved in revolutionary struggle, and I think you know, that is the fact that revolution, I suppose one of the questions I'm asking myself is that in the desire to move beyond form, get rid of both tragedy and comedy and so on and so forth in order to have pure authentic action, does he miss the absolutely extraordinarily powerful role that form plays in creating action in some sense, or giving action meaning? So that's partly the kind of flip. I don't know if that answers your question, but it was a really interesting set of questions and associations.
Can I come in on that again? I think on that conversation, because when you were going through the, let's say, antagonistic pairs in the Communist Manifesto, it almost reads like there is a structure that is antagonism and that allows for history to be historicized, and it becomes more and more abstract in that, right? I mean, that is just like how history operates. We move from clear personal domination to forms of impersonal domination. With differently, all of us, right? I mean, somehow, and but that sort of raises, and so I'm trying to think together, because if I understood correctly, that is part of what your claim, that one way of understanding tragedy as a structure that is determining history is by indicating a certain form of repetition that seems to generate a difference, but the difference doesn't change anything of the structure, right? We move from, and that is a problem for the entire history, I think, of Marxism and the stages of capitalism, right? I mean, it's there are even jokes about, right, that we're always living in the latest stage of capitalism, and it's never the last, right? I mean, that's the weird kind of thing. There's always a next to the very final one, it seems. And so it keeps dragging on after it, right, exhausted like itself. But that could imply that the relationship of order between tragedy and comedy, that as soon as one conceives of it as a relationship of order that allows us to think of history, that is part of the tragedy, right? So it's tragic that we think there is that kind of order, right? Because at one point Marx uses the image of the mole, right? And the mole is just very disoriented and right. I mean, it's blind and right. It's subterranean and it's unclear in which direction it moves, right? And that's a weird character, right? Of which one couldn't say it's a hero or it's also not a tragic character, for right. I mean, and I'm not sure. I think he's testing that kind of metaphor as an alternative also to that. But what I heard you implicitly say is part of what seems to be a almost meta tragic or tragedy as form discussion is that there seems to be a relationship of hierarchy of order between tragedy and comedy, and that has implications for how we look at history. And Marx just struggles with that, and that is what happens from 1789, 1851 to 1863. And then humor becomes interesting as category, because Hegel uses humor to describe the attitude of comic subjects, the humorous. And that means whatever happens to them, they just go on. So, I mean, they slip on a banana peel and they stand up and act as if nothing happens, right? So, and there's something interesting to that dynamic against the background, I think, of yes, structures might be tragic. Even the ordering, right? Tragedy turns into farce, but well, one goes on.
Yes.
And maybe humor is a good or is not a good category for that, but that kind of keeping at it, right? That because that seems to describe even Marx's subjectivity or the revolutionary subjectivity. Right? Keep at it under the worst conditions, under conditions. I mean, you described them like that, right? I mean, where all options are bad, right? Or as Lenin said, like all options are worse, right? I mean, and then, but does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So that it's, as you say, that even when there's a sequence, it's tragedy is the basic driver of history. But if you took humor as your model, it would be a different conceptualization of repetition in a way, actually,
Exactly.
and a more optimistic version of what repetition would mean. And I think that's very interesting, and I think it sort of speaks to it's very interesting. Again, you know, get too closely to the sort of literally critical kind of reading of this, but it is interesting that in the two in 43 and 63 he mentions Hegel aesthetics explicitly, but not in the 18th Brumaire, right? And it is interesting the extent to which in the 18th Brumaire, in bringing in farce, has he actually just got rid of? Is he not dealing? Is he only dealing with the Hegelian model of tragedy as a form of history? Has he sort of forgotten that there could and that's what I think is quite interesting. I mean, so that first passage where he says it, and maybe that's what he, when he says it in the example of Germany, he says that, why does this happen? why do we repeat things? And then he says, because we are, sort of comedy enables us, because he says something,
Have a happy parting.
yeah, to
Or happily.
yeah, to depart happily. And what you're saying is it's not a departure, right? But there is something in the, I suppose it's the happy conceptualization of repetition, or the happy conceptualization of the humorous conceptualization, which is, yeah. So for Marx, in there, it involves emancipating yourself from the past. But what you're saying is, if we don't think about it as an emancipation from the past, but actually in a kind of integration, then you get a happy outcome in a way. That's it.
And happy here just mean, like in the case of Lucian, for example, like just mere happenstance where you have a kind of a constellation of random events and stories that unfold. So in a way, this happy has a very odd root.
Yes, I think that's right. Anyway, that one, yeah, right. I mean, and Lucian is, and it goes to the sort of question there of satire. You know, Lucian is actually satire, it's not really humor. So, I mean, sorry, he's not comedy. And so that may be where humor in a non-comedic dramatic form also has a, you know, it becomes a different way of conceptualizing it.
And that could be like how men make history, but not under
Their
own conditions, right?
Yeah.
Conditions are tragic.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
That's, and it just doesn't mean just laugh at the face of the catastrophe,
No.
but, right? I mean, of course, then the category of humor carries a lot of weight, but nevertheless, it's a different form of repetition.
Yeah.
As to say.
Yeah.
I think there is a question. Jana, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, actually, you partly already answered my question, but then maybe I could just add something to the question so that this whole will be not in vain. The question was, I find it really interesting that there is a shift in Marx from comedy to farce. Like just in 18 Brumaire, he just talks instead of comedy from farce. And I was wondering if you have an idea, like, why is there, if it's just a like an arbitrary detail, or can we just dig in on this detail? And the other thing is an example which just occurred to me. I mean, the dialectical relation between farce and tragedy is maybe beyond the fact of repetition. Like, not only that it repeats, but maybe the relation is like only the one who expects the tragedy can also just see or just fall into in the farce. And my example is the one of the least humorous people that ever have lived, probably Martin Heidegger, just could be very humorous in the so-called Black Notebooks. And he just sees in a scene, like he just writes, and he just sees that that the Nazis just celebrate the 50th year of torpedo, and then just says, well, okay, if they will just celebrate, it doesn't change anything if they will celebrate also soon the 100th celebrate birthday of Hölderlin. After that they will just then celebrate something like what 50th anniversary of motorcycle or what. Like the moment is why I just gave the example is that Heidegger was the one who expected a rupture, a tragic rupture from this movement, from a revolution. And interestingly, this expectation could just bring in a mood so that he could just see the farce in this great expectation of the rupture. So so what I wanted to then say and ask you is like, do you think that's the expectation of tragedy itself is like already the beginning point of the shift into farce. Or another way, only the ones who just expect the tragedy also fall and see the farce.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And in fact, I wanted to ask Frank what he thought about the farce appearing there. I mean, I don't know. I don't know the answer to why Marx uses the word farce there. I mean, obviously I can see why he used it and what effect that has. But I don't know what know the specifics of I don't really know I don't know enough about what the word farce means.
Doesn't it come from facere, which means something like stuffing, like sausages?
Yeah.
Right, there's the famous scene in the 18th Brumaire where Napoleon takes power when he makes people say "Vive Napoleon, vive le saucisson." Right, he's the one. He is really stuffing his own sovereignty with people he buys, right, somehow, or gets on his side. So, I mean, maybe that's vulgarly, directly, etymologically speaking to that, but
well, yes. But even what does is farce considered to be a modern genre? Has it got a relationship to a particular kind of theatrical history at this point? I don't actually know enough to be able to say what it's. I mean, beyond that point, I think is very important. But is it related to does it have a kind of relationship to kind of domestic bourgeois theatre? What does it mean? And is it already signaling that we're not talking about old comedy or
comes in English it's an early modern interlude form, isn't it?
Yes.
It's a sort of eruption of laughter in between kind of moments within kind of a other stage drama. So I think
it's a transitory genre. But
it's not a genre. It's a sort of it's like the weird dance at the end of a Royal Shakespeare play. Right. It's sort of an interlude staging in between staging of something new within it.
Like the satyr play.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think it comes in as not force meat. Like early modern, kind of middle early modern period. But the force meat version is earlier. So it's a way of kind of stuffing out the theatrical time. Yeah,
okay.
Play.
Yeah,
in a sense. And within a specific economy.
Also, it's filler.
Yeah. It's a filling in that sense. Yeah.
And I think just like with so Engels writes to Marx a letter before I don't know, right? A bit before he writes that, and basically he cites Hegel with a reference, right? When Hegel talks about Caesarism and blah, right? The philosophy of history, and then Marx adds almost like Hegel.
But the interesting thing is that that's what people say, right? That he just gets it from Engels. But actually, the fact that 10 years earlier,
he
has that sequence.
He uses it twice, I think, early on. In the Hohenzollern critique that he writes there, there's another passage where he uses exactly that, and he speaks of farce there also.
Does he really? Oh, that's interesting. I definitely got that. So the use of the term must be important, and the presence and absence of comedy versus farce is obviously important. That's very interesting. And then you had a question about the expectation of tragedy is a kind of that sort of self. I mean, it made me think, if you think about ancient tragedies, or the cliche about ancient tragedies is that everyone always knows the story before it starts, right? So there's a sense there. That has to have something. to do with the question of the failure of the failure of agency in the notion of tragedy. Not just the significance of necessity and fate and all of those kinds of ideas, but also the idea that it's a story that can't really be rewritten, or a story which is already plotted. So you can't go to see a tragedy without an expectation of tragedy, in that sense.
Maybe expectation was not the right word. I just tried to express a kind of guess, because the question was why from comedy to farce, and my pretension was maybe it dialecticizes tragedy even more strongly, because if you just think that, like, I chose expectation because of the reason, because only if there is if you believe, or if there is an expectation of a rupture, and it's usually the case in pseudo revolutions, like, that was the way how Nazism just showed itself, or just tried to represent itself. It was like a big movement of decisions. And only if you really buy it, and if you really take it serious, and that's the dialecticizing moment, I would say, only then you can also just see the point of farce in it. Like, just and that was in the case, like the example with Heidegger, that the guy who just believed in it just saw that, okay, well, actually they are just celebrating motorcycle, and there's nothing here which has not anything to do with the big decisions which could just open a new path. And so that was the reason why I just thought about expectation. Yeah. But thanks for the answer. It's just opened a very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
I guess
Go on.
no, please.
No, I was just, again, I'm a classicist, I can't help myself, but it makes me go back to somewhat, again, like the relationship between Euripides and Aeschylus. When Euripides retells the story of Eurystheia, he has the moment in Euripides, Electra, where he mocks the recognition scene, right, where the relationship between where Electra and Orestes recognize each other, and a footprint, in the Aeschylean version, this is a great moment of tragic seriousness where these children recognize themselves in the loss of the father, and so on and so forth. And then in Euripides, it's like, well, surely a lock of hair wouldn't last so long, and a footprint, and so on and so forth. And so there already in it shows up the sort of farcical potential tragedy, but also just that the what am I trying to say? That it's not that Euripides is less tragic in that moment. In fact, what he's bringing out is a kind of there's something almost sort of tragic in the loss of the old order, right? In the loss of the potential to believe in the heroic code, in the loss of the potential to sort of see tokens as significant in that kind of movement towards a form of rationalization, that there is in that in a sense, that is a sort of definition of the tragic for Euripides, is that movement from one order to another. Because you're saying the kind of that is a kind of revolutionary moment, and that tragedy is the way to explain that difficulty of transition, which is what Aeschylus is telling in a different mode, which is the transition from a heroic order to democracy. But for him, that has to have the form grandiosity, whereas for Euripides, it's the questioning of the genre becomes part of the same sort of process of thinking about the relationship between of the view. I don't know if that helps, but it is a way of thinking about how within tragedy that is encoded, the sort of the question of expectation, the question of looking upon the tragic with certain expectations of what it can do and its relationship to the potential for revolutionary change and so on.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks.
Are there any other comments or questions? This was absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much, Miriam. And right now we can finally treat you also for pigs and some food. So join me in thanking Miriam one more time. This was wonderful.
So great discussion.